This is Audible.
On Full Automatic, Surviving 13 Months in Vietnam. Written by William V. Taylor, Jr. Narrated by Michael Curtis. Preface. This book is a memoir. It reflects my present recollections of experiences that occurred more than 50 years ago. As such, some names have been created because I cannot remember the actual names of the people they represent. However, all characters portrayed in this book reflect real individuals. To portray my experiences as realistically as possible, I found it necessary to use dialogue. It is impossible, of course, to remember the exact words people said more than 50 years ago, but I've done my best to reflect what was probable and realistic. In some scenes, I have used dialogue to reveal important details. I've done this only to tell the story in the most natural way possible. While the actual specific words spoken by any given character may not always be historically exact, they always reflect truth. Throughout this book, I've used the word Gook to describe the enemy, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong. I realize this is a derogatory term, but in 1967 through 1968, we used the term as a way of dehumanizing the enemy. To accurately reflect the reality of the period and the way we talked, I found it necessary to use the term frequently. I apologize to those who find it offensive. Though most of this book is derived from my own personal experiences, I have included some elements that were shared by other Marine veterans from my unit. I have included their stories when they are directly or closely related to my own. I've always felt it was a miracle that I survived Vietnam, and that there were angels looking out for me, perhaps for this very purpose, to tell this story, to honor the men I served with, and to honor the families who shared in their sacrifice. Finally, I must acknowledge the families and friends of all the military personnel who gave their lives in service of their country during the Vietnam War. While I realize that my descriptions of the violence of war may invoke painful memories, my intent has been only to honor those men for their sacrifices, that they may never be forgotten. Prologue. On Memorial Day 2017, Colonel Gerald F. Rekchek wrote a letter to the survivors of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 3rd Marine Regiment, who, along with Alpha, Bravo, and Delta companies, a helicopter squadron, and Navy elements, were the Special Landing Force Alpha in Vietnam from February 1967 to November 1967. Here is the letter. Monday, May 29, 2017. 50 years ago now, and as Memorial Day approaches, each of you lived and demonstrated what the current values of the Marine Corps are all about: honor, courage, and commitment. Your actions on the battlefield reflected those values when the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marine Regiment took the fight to the Viet Cong and NVA base areas in the Republic of South Vietnam. Over the years, you have heard or read about the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley with the 7th Cavalry in March 1965. Or saw the movie We Were Soldiers. Over the years, you have heard or read about the New Year Tet Offensive in February 1968, of the battle for Saigon, and the battle to retake the city of Hue, the Citadel and the Imperial Palace from the NVA and VC. Over the years, you have heard or read about the Siege of Khe Sanh in February and March 1968, and also the Battle of Dai Do along the Qua Viet River. The courage and commitment of the American and South Vietnamese fighting men prevailed in all of these battles and defeated the NVA and VC. The Special Landing Force concept of operations was put into action in 1967 as part of General Westmoreland's new strategy to take U.S. offensive action into the base areas of the NVA and VC. Little did the Marines of 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines know that they would become a key player of that strategy when they conducted a tactical retrograde from Khe Sanh in February 1967, where they were defending the combat base while it was being built up to become a military and political target for the NVA and their government. 1st Battalion 3rd Marines redeployed to Okinawa to re-equip, rehab, and train to become the ground combat element of Special Landing Force Alpha as part of the 9th Marine Amphibious Brigade. The aviation combat element was a squadron of UH-34 helicopters from HMM 263, nicknamed the Thunder Eagles. That squadron and their pilots were magnificent. They flew from the USS Okinawa in all kinds of conditions, day or night, to support our Marines on the ground. Their first priority was to do whatever it took to answer the call from 1st Battalion 3rd Marines in the battle on the ground. As an example, one of their birds brought a resupply of ammo and offloaded the ammo in the middle of Charlie Company on May 10th. They stayed there on the ground, at our request, so we could load seriously wounded casualties aboard. We found out later, after the operation, that when the bird landed on the Okinawa with our casualties, the crew counted 34 holes in the fuselage. We can never give them enough kudos for what they did for us. Thank you, Thunder Eagles. SLF Alpha, with 1-3 Marines and the rest of the battalion landing team and the amphibious ready group that made up the Special Landing Force, had the mobility, combat capability, and combat support to respond to 3rd Marine Amphibious Force operations in I Corps, which was commanded by Lieutenant General Lewis Walt, United States Marine Corps. 1-3 Marines answered the call, time after time engaging VC and NVA forces in search and destroy operations throughout all of I Corps, from the Ben Hai River bordering North Vietnam and south to Chu Lai, and west to the border of Laos at Hip Duc and places in between, such as Quai Son, Hoi An, Go Noi Island, the Street Without Joy, Quang Tri, the DMZ, and the Marketplace. During the approximate 6 months or so as SLF Alpha, BLT-13 was awarded 2 Presidential Unit citations, one by the 1st Marine Division and one by the 3rd Marine Division. Each of you was no small part of those operations. You distinguished yourselves and were recognized by being awarded the highest combat unit distinguishing citation by the U.S. Marine Corps. Well done, BLT-13 Marines and sailors. We can never forget the costs and sacrifices of our buddies and comrades in arms that we lost in battle. They were lost, but never forgotten. Their names are etched on the wall, but still live on in our memories all the days of our lives. May God rest their souls and grant them eternal peace and comfort to their families. They died defending freedom and fighting for us so that we could be successful in battle and life. We salute them and recognize their sacrifice on this Memorial Day. Each of you has your own stories to tell on this Memorial Day. Tell your stories in whatever form that you have available to you. Your families, friends, and your communities need to hear them. Semper Fidelis. Gerald F. Rekchek, Colonel, United States Marine Corps, retired. Charlie 6. I'm Bill Taylor, a Marine from Charlie Company 1st Battalion 3rd Marines. I was there and served with Special Landing Force Alpha in 1967 during the height of the Vietnam War. This is my story. Chapter 1. We were speeding toward the coast of Vietnam when our convoy of ships ran directly into Typhoon Violet, packing 115-mile-per-hour winds. There were specific orders against going to the carrier's flight deck, but I needed to get away from the putrid smells of the seasick Marines confined within the ship. Desperate for fresh air, I snuck my way to the deck and opened the steel door. Extreme wind and cool, wet spray hit my face. I took a long, deep breath of the sea-salted air and was immediately refreshed. I was then entranced by what I saw next to us in the colossal wave. The USS Duluth, a transport ship that carried the fleet's Amtracs, had just ridden up the side of a 50-foot swell. The bow came completely out of the water, exposing the entire front end of the ship. Then, like a 40-story building turned sideways, she drove through the crest of the wave. The stern rose high, and I could see propellers churning out of the water. With all its weight rushing forward, the front end burst through the incoming wave with an explosion of spray that went as high and as far as the bridge where the crew steered the great ship. Then she pointed skyward again, riding up to repeat the process over and over. Beyond the USS Duluth, miles and miles across the violent sea, I searched for some steady line of horizon, for some sense of the earth beneath us. I was an 18-year-old Marine who, like so many before me, had embarked across the vastness of the sea to serve my country and to stop our enemies where they stood. I wanted to prove myself to the other Marines and to prove myself worthy of the title, but truth be told, I was still just a young man, unsure of myself and afraid of whatever fate awaited us on the other side of the storm. I found no horizon out there, only an ocean swelling and spitting cold spray into a gray sky. I tasted salt on my lips and felt the sting of it in my eyes like sweat as I steadied myself. I couldn't help but think of John Basilone, a great Marine who crossed the very same sea, fought heroically in the Battle of Guadalcanal, and then later died on the first day of Iwo Jima. The thought occurred to me that giving one's life is the ultimate sacrifice, and that I could soon be among those called to make it. I held some pride in the fact that, as a Marine, I had promised to do my duty for my country. I had passed the point of no return. The fleet would not be turning around for me. Whatever was going to happen was going to happen, but damn it, I had no intention of dying. I wanted to survive my 13 months, the tour of duty for a Marine, and then come home to marry Kathy. I could live with my head held high, knowing that, like those who served before me, I answered the call. After 2 days of battling the storm, the ship resumed her course, heading for the coast of Vietnam. On April 26, 1967, we arrived 30 miles south of Da Nang City. That afternoon, we were called to the hangar deck, where helicopters are stored, just below the flight deck. Marines streamed in from all directions and gathered in groups. My unit, Charlie Company, gathered at the rear of the ship, where some mechanics were working on one of the choppers. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd platoons, along with the weapons platoon, were positioned left, center, and right, respectively. Our company commander, Captain Rekchek, looked totally squared away as he walked toward us with a complement of 4 platoon lieutenants at his side. 200 Marines jumped up as someone yelled, "Platoon hut!" "At ease," Captain Rekchek said. "Sit, Marines." Everyone looked around and began sitting where they could. 4 battalions of Marines, plus 3 ARVN battalions, are closing in on what we think could be a full regiment of NVA troops in the foothills south of Da Nang. There have been reports of significant enemy movements, and we should assume the locals in the area are sympathetic to the VC and NVA, Captain Rekchek said. I considered the scope of what he was saying. 4 battalions would have been as many as 4,500 Marines. With the ARVN, or Army of the Republic of Vietnam battalions, there would have been as many as 3,000 more men out there. Against a regiment of NVA, North Vietnamese Army, I liked the odds, but still the sheer numbers were frightening. "This area is called the Quai Son Valley," Rekchek continued. "They have controlled it since the beginning of the war because it's been a big source for rice and for rations. So we're going in to take control of the valley and stop them." "Semper Fi!" one of the Marines yelled. "The valley extends into the foothills directly west of where we'll be landing," he said. "After we land, we're going to move up the center of the valley until we hit the foothills. The Marines and ARVN out there should be sweeping south of us and north of us, which means that if those NVA are out there, we are going to find them in the valley and corner them on all sides. Men, it will be our job to trap and eliminate the enemy. Only God knows what lies ahead of us, but I do know one thing for sure. You will take care of each other. I have confidence that we will accomplish this mission and be successful. Gentlemen, we take off at 06:30 in the morning." "Dismissed!" someone yelled. I looked at the men's faces. Some appeared to be inspired by Rekchek's talk and excited about the thought of going into combat for the first time, They wore eager smiles, chewed on their gum more vigorously, and kidded around. Still, others were clearly worried. They stared off in the distance, as if looking into an abyss. As for me, I wasn't sure how to feel. Our first operation was to be called Operation Beaver Cage. God only knows who came up with the name, but this was it. We were going to do what we had trained to do, find and kill the enemy. I followed the group that gravitated to where our bunks and letter gear resided. I wanted to send letters to all my friends and family. The letters could be, I knew, the last words they might ever hear from me. We woke up before dawn, 4:30 a.m. 1 in 10 men started to stir right away. I wasn't one of them. I had stayed up late writing letters, 12 in all, plus a very long one to my high school sweetheart, Kathy. I lay there for a time, clinging to the safety of my bunk and the comfort of sleep as half-naked Marines headed for the shower, the last that any of them would have for a long time. Someone screamed from the snap of a wet towel. The grab-ass had begun. Everyone wanted that last gratifying meal before flying off to battle, so we headed to the chow hall and filled ourselves with runny scrambled eggs, half-cooked bacon, and greasy linked sausage. After breakfast, I spread everything I was taking into combat on the floor at my feet. There was no way I was going to fit everything in my pack. It became truly hectic. What do you take into combat? The hard decisions had to be made. Do I take more ammo to fight off the enemy? On the other side, I certainly didn't want to run out of food. The other supporting gear was important too. I needed my letter writing gear, extra socks to keep my feet dry, soap, toothbrush, and a camera and plenty of film to record my experiences, just to mention a few of the items. With gear and food all over the floor, and with 50 anxious Marines crammed together like sardines, tension was high and tempers started to flare. One of the Marines stood up from his bunk and bumped his pack into another Marine, who then fell over his gear. A small fight ensued. There was plenty of yelling and screaming, but the fight was quickly broken up. I made a last check of all my gear. My cartridge belt was worn around my waist. It held 2 canteens of fresh, clean water, one on each side. I had a small medical kit located at the back of my belt, which contained a heavy-duty rubber band that acted as a tourniquet, gauze wrappings, Band-Aids, and various tubes of salves. All the Marines purchased a unique combat knife called the K-bar. I had one of these sharp knives on the right side of my belt and a bayonet on the other. My rifle needed a magazine to hold the ammunition. Each magazine contained 20 rounds, so I added 4 magazine pouches to my belt. Each pouch held 2 magazines. It was obvious I was going to need more ammo, so I picked up 2 7-pocket bandoliers. A bandolier has a cloth strap that connects to 7 pockets sewn together. Each pocket is large enough to hold 1 magazine. Both bandoliers would then give me 14 extra magazines. They were draped from my left shoulder to under my right arm. In all, this gave me 22 magazines. It seemed like more than enough ammo to take into combat at the time. I had had to dye my underwear green so I wouldn't make myself a target when relieving myself. We were issued 2 long green jungle jackets. The jackets had large saddle pockets where I kept my extra grenades. Each jacket had 2 chest pockets where most of the guys kept their cigs. Being a non-smoker, I kept my bug spray in there. The loose-fitting jungle pants had 4 pockets, 2 normal slit pockets, and 2 long button pockets down the outside of my thighs. Our dog tags were shiny as hell, so Jones, the squad leader, gave us black electrical tape to secure them, solving 2 problems, keeping the glare down and stopping the clanging when they were free-flowing. My helmet had a jungle montage of green leaves imprinted on the cloth cover. The helmet liner secured the cloth into place, and there were little slits in the cloth to slip in live small branches for a realistic camouflage effect. Some of us were going into battle without the new jungle boots that were promised. I, of course, was one of the unlucky guys. Apparently, someone in the rear neglected to do his job, and we ran short of my size 11. I was looking forward to those boots, too. They were unique because of the thin metal strips in the soles to deflect the dreaded punji sticks. Another good feature was that the sides of the boot were made of a porous green cloth that would evaporate moisture around the feet and cut down on jungle rot. With my pack filled to capacity, I strapped my shovel and poncho to the back and was now ready for combat. I waited in the squad bay with 2nd Platoon until we heard the call to move out. "Hit 'em up! Move 'em out!" someone yelled, words from the theme song to the TV series Rawhide. I finished the jingle. "Rollin', rollin', rollin', keep them doggies rollin'," I sang. "Rawhide." Someone laughed. He must have also watched the show. We moved down the hallway and up 3 precipitous steel, almost vertical stairways. As we emerged from the depths of the ship to the hangar deck, we picked up hand grenades from boxes on the deck. The ship's PA system kicked in. "Now hear this. Battle stations. Battle stations." Excitement raged inside me at this point. It was like the first time I stood in line for the roller coaster at the Riverview Amusement Park in Chicago. I was 7 years old, standing in a long line with my sister Bev, waiting for our turn on the infamous Bobs. The advertising for the Bobs said, "One of the fastest roller coasters in the world, 150 miles per hour, and lots of crazy drops." I remember feeling like I wanted to get out of the line because it seemed too scary. I didn't get out of line, and all went well, though. I wasn't going to be able to get out of this line either. Our platoon moved in a long line to the front of the hangar deck. No one talked, just followed the person in front of him to a steep stairway and to a hallway that led to the flight deck. The closer we got, the louder the sounds from the choppers warming their engines became. I got to the doorway of the flight deck. 5 men in front of me were escorted to a chopper. Each time a flight deck member arrived at the door, he took the next 5 to their respective chopper. Now it was my group's turn. 5 of us ran to the center of the flight deck and jumped aboard our chopper as we had practiced in training. I sat on the floor next to the door gunner, who wore a green, full-bodied flight suit and a war-worn aviation helmet. He gave us a thumbs-up sign. I smiled and passed the sign back. The others in my group, Mac, Ski, Smitty, and Pilgreen, had the same look of quiet apprehension on their faces. No one had anything to say until finally Ski thrust his M16 out in front of himself and yelled, "Geronimo!" Everyone smiled. It was 6:45 a.m., and the go-ahead sign must have been given because our chopper's engine started to rev up. The exhaust pipes protruding from the front nose section spewed plumes of diesel-smelling fumes. The speed of the turning blades increased, and the downdraft began to dissipate the fumes. As the engine reached full throttle, the chopper began to shake with such violence that it seemed the machine could rip apart at any second. We could feel the chopper lifting off the deck. As soon as we were airborne, the ride became smoother. The nose of the chopper dipped, the tail lifted, and we moved forward and up over the sea. As we continued to lift, I could see many choppers converging for the attack. Looking out the open door, I noticed the hospital ship USS Sanctuary, entirely painted in pristine white, with large red crosses on the sides of the ship. It was eerie and comforting at the same time. As we continued to climb, the sound of the engine diminished because our ears had plugged from the changes in atmospheric pressure. I yawned to relieve the pressure, and a flood of sound rushed back into my ears. Off we went into the morning sky. The choppers behind us caught up, and we were flying in a close formation. I felt the anticipation of my situation in my stomach and wanted to see where we were. Being next to the door gunner, I was able to lean forward as far as I could and see the shoreline below. It stretched for miles, sandy beaches all up and down the coast. A short distance from the shoreline, I felt as if we were slowly descending. Square rice paddies and fields of corn became visible as we neared the ground. I was shocked to see an old farmer running for his life and poking his water buffalo in the hindquarters to make it move faster. I'm sure he was terrified, as 12 helicopters were now landing in his backyard. Smitty, my team leader, said, "Lock and load," and we all put a round in the chamber of our M16s. The chopper was losing altitude fast. The ground came closer, and our ears felt the pressure of the descent. As we neared one of the paddy fields, I felt a rush of adrenaline surging through my body, and I began to shake inside. The pilot raced the engine to counteract the gravity pulling at the fast descending chopper. He lifted the front end slightly to allow the single back wheel to touch first, and in one smooth maneuver, the two front wheels touched a second later. I jumped out of the open door and found myself on hard ground, moving forward and on line with the other Marines. We looked intently for any signs of the enemy. There were no incoming rounds. The chopper's engines began accelerating with an ear-shattering roar. The tail of our chopper lifted, and the spinning blades threw debris in all directions as it moved away. We had landed at 7:11 a.m. In a matter of a couple of minutes, we had 60 men down and ready to fight. On the other side of the coin, we were alone, and the choppers had left the area, returning to the sea where the next group of Marines was waiting. Lieutenant Francis was on the radio, and orders started coming in from Captain Rekchek to widen the landing zone because more choppers were coming in with more Marines. Jones, my squad leader, yelled, "Spread out and move forward." We secured the area around us and continued to spread out. It was still early morning, and the temperature was about 85 degrees. Because of the heat and high humidity, our foreheads and bodies dripped with sweat. Vietnam was a lot hotter than Okinawa, where we had trained for the Special Landing Force, the SLF. It felt like we were in a humid oven. Our packs and gear weighed between 40 and 50 pounds. My platoon staff sergeant, Malloy, spotted one of the Marines downing water. "Tell your men to conserve their water," he yelled at the squad leaders. "We have to be out here 3 days before our next resupply." We didn't receive any fire on our first landing, and we were relieved that no one was hurt. Most of the Marines were digging small fighting holes, but not nearly as deep as we should have. It was just too hot, and besides, the area appeared to be tranquil. The next group of choppers came in exactly where we had landed, and after about an hour and a half, Charlie Company was on the ground. The other companies, Alpha, Bravo, and Delta, were landing in other locations. "Pack 'em up and get ready to move out," Sergeant Jones commanded. "The chopper pilots landed us too close to the ocean. We're over 3 miles from the LZ where we were supposed to land. Our new orders are to move out and sweep down the valley toward the foothills." Pilgreen looked at me, shaking his head in disbelief. With a disgusted look on his face, he said in his southern drawl, "This shit ain't getting it, is it?" I had to agree with him. I sure wasn't looking forward to a long hike with the weight of all my gear in such horrible heat. We started to move out with 1st Platoon on our left flank, my platoon in the middle, and 3rd Platoon on the right. We were always told in training that you spread out so that no mortar round kills more than one Marine. Each platoon had a pair of M60 machine guns attached to them from Weapons Platoon. Weapons Platoon, which consisted of Marines armed with M60 heavy-duty machine guns, rockets, and mortars, could be called upon from any platoon for support. We started moving slowly toward the hills to our west and away from the ocean. The ground was made up of 90% pure white sand and 10% dirt. Short, thin stalks of weeds protruded everywhere. We had to cross a lot of real estate between us and the hills. After about 3 hours of struggling with the sandy ground, we came upon an area that was rich in jungle growth. As we entered the tangle of weeds and trees, enemy machine gun fire erupted from our front. I was near 3rd Platoon when the firing commenced. It sounded like several AK-47 machine guns. 2nd and 3rd Platoons became mixed in the thicket as everyone ran for cover. I dove forward toward a downed tree and lay in the prone position. Using the tree as cover, I fired an entire magazine of 20 rounds toward the sound of the enemy fire. The enemy was well hidden, and I was unable to see them because the jungle growth was too thick. Dan Varner from 3rd Platoon was next to me. "Screw this shit," he said. He sat up with his legs crossed Indian style and aimed directly at something. I yelled for him to get under cover. He looked at me for a second and said in a nonchalant way, "You can't hit what you can't see." Bullets were dancing around him. It was a miracle he didn't get hit. He was the bravest person I had ever actually seen, in true esprit de corps. The gooks, as we began to call the enemy, must have been able to see him, but apparently couldn't shoot worth a shit. The fire stopped as abruptly as it began, and the enemy disappeared. We were soon to find out this was a delaying tactic they would use on us repeatedly. It worked, too. We didn't move for another hour while a few Marines cleared the area ahead. No one had been hit, but it was my first contact. The act of training for that scenario was much different than experiencing it firsthand. People were actually using bullets from machine guns, and they were trying to kill me. I felt helpless as I lay trapped on the ground, and an uncertain feeling came over me. What did I get myself into? The order came down, and we continued our march. The guys complained about the extreme heat as we approached the foothills. I heard a bloop sound in the distance. Then I heard another, and another. "Hit the deck!" someone yelled. The new guys, like me, watched as the old salts all hit the ground. Then I heard a whistling whoosh go over my head, and many more after that. Explosions hit to my rear. We were getting hit by mortar rounds. I would recognize that sound for the rest of the war. All we could do was take cover. They exploded like the hand grenades we used at the range. We couldn't see any movement from the location where the sounds were coming from, but we kept hearing bloop, bloop in the distance in front of us just over a hill. The next set of rounds hit closer to us as the enemy adjusted their fire. I recognized that they were zeroing in on us, and it really became frightening. They must have had a spotter on top of the hill passing adjusted fire instructions to their mortarmen. Don Bumgarner, our own mortarman, was instructed to return fire. He sent his rounds toward the enemy positions, which suppressed the enemy fire. I began wondering about our ability to fight a large battle. They had hit us, but we hadn't even seen them yet. I realized that we had encountered a small unit, but they had been in control of the battle and were able to stop an entire company of Marines. Captain Rekchek was cautious not to overreact and do something stupid, which I could appreciate. But I still wondered what would happen if thousands attacked us. After all, Captain Rekchek had said there was believed to be a full regiment of NVA troops in the area. It wasn't a game. I knew we were playing for keeps. It was time to be more alert because anything could happen at any moment. After about 3 more hours of walking, we stopped to wait for a medevac chopper. 6 Marines had heat exhaustion and were unable to continue. That was another hour of not moving. The temperature had to be over 110 degrees. Our heavily laden packs and a shortage of water didn't make life any easier. We ended up moving out and continued to sweep until 6 p.m. when we finally stopped for the evening. Charlie Company set in on the west side of the valley near a small village. First platoon was sent into the village to check it out thoroughly. One of the Marines discovered a bunker loaded with 3,000 pounds of rice. It was thought to be for the NVA and VC units in the area, so the Marines were told to destroy it and then return to the lines. Engineers were called on the radio to blow up the contraband. "Fire in the hole!" someone yelled. There was a huge explosion, and then an enormous amount of smoke billowed up from the center of the village. The rice was totally destroyed. First platoon returned to stand watch on the lines for the evening with the rest of us. The best protection for a company of Marines for the night was to use the old circling the wagons routine like in the Old West. We all set up our fighting holes next to each other. One fighting hole connected to another until we had a complete circle. Jones came around with someone from weapons platoon to set up the fields of fire. It was extremely hot, but for my platoon, the evening was otherwise uneventful. I had started the operation with 2 canteens of water and went through 1 1/4 on the first day. I was dying of thirst, but at the same time I realized I had to conserve. Most of the other Marines were completely out. One of the lieutenants from Alpha Company sent 2 squads, 30 men, out of the lines and down into a ravine where there was known to be a small stream. Their mission was to bring back as much water as they could, using extra canteens gathered from Alpha Company. When they arrived at the stream, the anxious, thirsty, mostly 18 and 19-year-olds dropped their rifles and gear to fill canteens. The Marines knelt down to unscrew canteen caps, and as they plunged the canteens under the water, they scanned their surroundings apprehensively. The men worked quickly and quietly. Though there was no sign of the enemy, some could undoubtedly sense a presence, the invisible eyes of some predator staring them down. A couple of the Marines noticed large rocks and quietly edged themselves toward the cover. Just then, a well-placed machine gun in a haystack plus other automatic weapons from as many as 60 to 70 NVA, opened up on the ill-fated Marines. 20 were hit immediately. The 2 squads tried to return fire, but the enemy's firepower was overwhelming. Of the 20 Marines, 14 were killed outright. 9 ended up wounded, but were able to escape back to the lines to be medevaced out to the USS Okinawa and the USS Sanctuary. Artillery was called in on the enemy position, and Alpha Company was able to recover its dead using the artillery barrage for cover. The officer who ordered the water run told the company commander that he had sent out a patrol and not a water run. The official record states that a patrol went out and was ambushed. There was talk that the officer lied to save his reputation. At dawn, we were told to move out about 100 yards near a large, dry rice paddy. We were being airlifted to a location called LZ Buzzard. As the choppers approached our position, Showships, an American Indian Marine from our 2nd Fire Team, said, "Someone call for a limo?" Ski, a short, thin, 5-foot 1-inch Marine, said, "I did. I also ordered some cocktails and suntan lotion." It felt great to laugh again. Once on board, we were told to remove our flak jackets and leave them on the choppers. With all the heat casualties, they were just too hot to wear. After a short ride, we landed at LZ Buzzard and marched closer toward the foothills, where a Marine recon unit had reported many enemy positions. We ended up on a long, hot, sweaty walk that was much farther than it looked. Training did help us push ourselves, humping one foot after the other. The heat was so brutal and intense that even without the flak jackets, men were still dropping like flies. Our company commander called for 10 medevac choppers. 65 men had come down with severe heat stroke, and it took a long time to get them all medevaced. Some of the Marines' eyes were starting to roll back into their heads, which is never a good sign. I found out later that at the same time, Captain Rekchek was being reprimanded on the radio because the company was not close to where we were supposed to be. He was ordered to send as many men as he could to the top of the first foothill and secure it, now. Rekchek immediately got the lieutenant from 3rd Platoon and sent him with the squad on a forced march to the top of the hill. Exhausted upon getting to the high ground, they spotted a VC in black pajamas in the valley below. He was down on one knee watching our company's progress as we moved up the valley, definitely an enemy scout. The lieutenant set up an M60 machine gun and opened fire at the lone soldier. The rounds danced around him, and he leaped headfirst into the brush of a tree line. The man in the black pajamas disappeared into the foliage. The lieutenant set up a defensive position at the top of the hill until the rest of the company arrived. My platoon commander, Lieutenant Francis, and my squad leader, Sergeant Jones, had us walk up the side of a hill a little south of the command post, or CP. Our hill was loaded with a heavy weed growth, 3 to 4 feet high. We struggled in the heat to get to the top, and once there, we secured the hill. Our location was right in the middle of the company. The command post and 3rd Platoon were at our right flank and exposed to enemy fire. The CP was getting creamed by mortar rounds fired from the hills in the distance. The enemy position was well concealed and protected by huge boulders. The accuracy of the bombardment was such that the North Vietnamese must have set up the coordinates prior to our arrival. The initial mortar rounds hit right on target. They must have had some indication we were coming because they had us zeroed in like hunters shooting ducks in a pond. From the CP, Rekchek had our forward observer, or FO, call in an airstrike on the enemy positions. 2 F-4 Phantom jets came in, and each dropped 2 500-pound bombs on the surrounding hills. At the same time, 105mm cannons from one of our bases sent huge rounds into the rocks where the enemy fire had been coming from. Enormous explosions erupted in front of our positions. Our platoon was receiving sniper and machine gun fire from closer, hidden positions in front of us, not far from a village in the valley. The enemy couldn't get a good read on us because of the heavy weeds we had settled into. I had hated those weeds going up the hill, but now they'd become our savior. The gunfire became more of a harassing fire, just keeping us pinned down for the time being. Bravo Company, to our left, was given orders to sweep the hills and flank the enemy in front of us. As they moved around, they ended up in the same situation in which we found ourselves. Bravo Company got pinned down and was getting mortared as large groups of NVA shot machine gun fire into their positions. Bravo Company was receiving more casualties than we were. At this juncture, hundreds of North Vietnamese moved forward toward our positions as mortars began to fall all around us. Machine gun fire was hitting us from the large rocks to our front. Several Marines were severely wounded from the attack. Dave Hart, 1st Squad, and Ed Kalwara, attached to our platoon as a machine gunner, were right next to each other laying down fire on the enemy. They were no more than 10 inches apart looking at the hills in front of them when a bullet whizzed directly into Hart's chest and sent him backward to the ground. Kalwara reacted with the speed of a jackrabbit and hit the ground alongside him. Kalwara told me that he crawled to Hart thinking there might be something he could do, but it was obvious that Hart was already gone. He told me that he could have been the one lying there dead. The bullet that struck Hart had been only inches away from him as well. Corpsmen moved bravely into the oncoming fire to help patch up the wounded and move them to the landing zone. With some hesitation in the continuing fire, Captain Rekchek called in the medevac choppers. For those critically wounded, every second was vital. We watched as the choppers landed. They took fire mostly from the front. We saw the enemy in the distance, moving from their positions to our right flank to get a better shot. They didn't have the big packs we had and were not heavily laden with gear. All we could see was a glimpse of men in black pajamas as they carried their AK-47s. They were fast and stealthy. The choppers kept landing while the crew kicked off extra ammo and helped the wounded aboard. I saw one of the choppers take numerous rounds as it landed and then receive more fire as it took off with the wounded inside. How it kept flying, I will never know. I looked up to the sky because I heard the jets above. They came roaring in and targeted the area in front of us. I was happy as they dumped their loads of 2 500-pound bombs on the entrenched enemy. Another pair of jets came in and unloaded large canisters of flaming napalm in the densely wooded hills. It was awesome to see our firepower in action, saving the day. The sniper fire stopped immediately. The enemy must have either left the area or gone underground. It seemed like the logical thing to do. Other Marine battalions were in the vicinity, and we could see the jets and Hueys in the distance on our left and right flanks shooting rockets into the hills. I saw the great coordination of firepower we had over the NVA, but even as a well-trained Marine, I was still terrified at what could be lurking out there waiting for me in the coming night. After the artillery and airstrikes came to an end, it appeared the enemy had retreated for the time being. With the enemy guns now quiet, the company moved cautiously forward. At dusk, Captain Rekchek called for the company to stop and dig in for the night. He decided to use a B-52 crater for cover. Without any warning, mortar rounds and sniper fire erupted again and began hitting the exposed point men. 4 Marines were wounded and trapped 30 yards out. Roger Bacon and a couple of other Marines who were with Captain Rekchek in the crater jumped up from the cover and ran to a trench just behind the fallen men. The Marines who followed Bacon gave suppressing fire as Bacon jumped out and dragged each man, one at a time, into the safety of the trench. John Steiner and I heard the firing to our front and right. We were setting in for the night, and we thought it would be best to dig our fighting hole a little deeper for a better defense. The ground was hard as cement, and it took us quite a while to get an extra couple of feet. We took turns digging in the horrible heat. The weeds that protected us from the snipers became a disadvantage again. With night approaching, I imagined how the enemy could slowly and quietly creep up on us, using the weeds as cover. To make matters worse, there was no moon this evening. I could see it was going to be a long night. Steiner and I waited for darkness before carefully crawling out of our positions. We had to push the brush down directly in front of us for 15 yards. Sergeant Jones crawled along the lines to make sure 2nd Platoon was ready for the possible onslaught before us. He came over to the hole where Steiner and I were. "Be prepared and stay awake, because we're expecting to get overrun this evening," Jones said. "There are thousands of gooks out there, so just stay alert. You know those F-4 Phantom jets that were hitting the gooks to our west?" "Yeah, I saw them," I said. Jones added, "One of our FOs saw movement in the hills. There weren't supposed to be any friendlies in the area, and an airstrike was called in. The jets sent 8 rockets directly on the movement. It turns out it was another outfit sweeping the hills, and they were not on our radio frequency. Our jets killed 5 and wounded 24 of our own Marines. I shook my head. It was enough to worry about getting killed by the enemy, but now I'd be looking over my shoulder wondering if the good guys had me in their sights. Anyway, he sighed, shaking his head. No smoking and only cold food tonight. It's too bad about Hart, I said. Did anyone else get it? Second platoon got some wounded, but Hart was the only one who didn't make it, Jones said. He then crawled off to the next firing position out of our sight. Hart was the first man to die from our platoon, but he wasn't going to be the last. The sun had set, and the night came with a cloak of darkness so total that I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Around 11:30 p.m., random explosions started up and down the lines. They were enemy mortars. It was a harassing fire, a somewhat chaotic plan, hoping they would get lucky or draw fire to give away our positions. Their mortarmen sent rounds everywhere, and hot shrapnel zinged in all directions. The explosions became much more powerful, and we knew they must have been using recoilless rifles. Recoilless rifles are actually small artillery pieces. A large shell is placed inside a portable tube that is attached to a tripod and fired. The NVA's larger units carried them, and were using them on us. Steiner and I sunk into our fighting hole, glad we had dug it deeper. About an hour later, we heard artillery rounds coming in from our backs, going over our heads toward the enemy. There were huge explosions in the valley, and then on the hills in front of us. I realized then that the artillery was called in to suppress the enemy's recoilless rifles. Small firefights arose in the valley from listening posts and Marine reconnaissance units. The North Vietnamese had come out to kill Americans and were probing for any weakness. They were out there in force. Both Steiner and I were frozen in place, waiting to see or hear anything. If only there had been a little light, we would have felt more secure. Our senses now played an important role in staying alive. The only thing we could do was to sit and wait for anything out of the ordinary. Our minds started playing tricks on us as it got later in the evening. You hear that? Steiner would ask. Listening intently, I would say, No, I didn't. A few minutes would pass, and we would do it all over again, several times. I grabbed my canteen and drank the last vestiges of water from it. I was too scared to worry about the water at this point, because I was just trying to stay alive. Small firefights broke out again in the valley about 1 a.m., when I heard a faint sound of an airplane, first from a distance and then louder as it began to fly above us. The plane dropped a flare that drifted down slowly. It lit up the entire area like daylight for 2 whole minutes. We felt a few moments of relief and confidence as long as it stayed lit. But of course the light would burn out, and again, there was nothing Steiner or I could see in our field of fire. Out of the darkened sky, a brilliant stream of red light shot like a laser from the plane and flowed all the way to the ground. A loud, fast roaring and whining sound followed just a few seconds later, the delayed sound from the airplane's miniguns. We had heard about Spooky, but none of us had ever seen him. The old salts talked about a plane that could put a bullet in every square inch of a football field in 1 minute. There was another name for Spooky. It was Puff, as in Puff the Magic Dragon. The stream of light was actually thousands of tracer rounds giving the effect of a dragon's breath spewing death and destruction from above. Every 5th round fired was a tracer round. A tracer is like a Star Wars laser. It's a bullet that glows with red-hot phosphorus and provides a visual aid for better aiming. There were so many tracers that they gave the illusion of a single ray of red light. One minigun shoots 100 rounds per second, and there were 3 firing at the same time. We had heard the plane carried infrared detection and could see heat signatures from the enemy on the ground. Our fire-breathing dragon had to be terrifying to the enemy. Puff stayed with us for several hours, disappearing and then returning, dropping its large flares to light up the area and breathe its showers of machine gun bullets from above. God, I was glad he was on our side. I can't imagine how many enemy combatants Spooky killed or wounded. Between Spooky, the artillery, and a fear of being attacked, we didn't get much sleep that night. Any plans the enemy might have had to overrun us were thwarted after Spooky appeared, but we stayed on high alert throughout the night. Charlie was still out there. By morning, the enemy was quiet. Those who survived our dragon's breath had disappeared into the night. Charlie Company went on the hunt once more, but other than occasional harassing and delaying sniper fire, our search demonstrated the enemy's elusive strategy. They would choose the time and place to confront us again. A couple of days later, we were online, sweeping in hilly terrain toward a large reservoir in a beautiful grassy valley. As we approached, we could see the reservoir stretched far and wide, 3/4 of a mile all the way up to some scattered rock formations in the distance. We were at the top of a hill, looking down into the valley, and the lack of cover was obvious. Captain Rekchek sensed danger and gave the order to halt and take a break while he figured a plan to move through the open valley. Bacon took off the heavy radio he was carrying for Lieutenant Sutton. The break wasn't very long, as heavy machine gun fire and mortars opened up and began concentrating on some exposed Marines at the front of the column. Bacon was on top of the hill looking down with some semblance of cover. A mortar round hit down in the valley and a little to the left of his position. The next one was in the middle of the hill. "Where's the fire coming from?" someone yelled. Bacon raised his torso to take a look and said, "I think it's," and before he could say another word, a mortar round hit directly in front of him, knocking him unconscious. He was thrown backward as the shrapnel blasted his body, along with 4 other Marines. One of the other Marines, who was closer to the blast, died immediately. He may have sheltered Bacon from the full force of the blast. Doc Eastman was called. He and a couple of others helped Bacon and the other wounded to the LZ. It was May 10th. All the battalions were sweeping the same area looking for Charlie, which was another name we called the enemy. In the distance, we could see our jets hitting positions in the hills. A unit must have spotted movement and called in for the airstrikes. We continued sweeping and chasing small units, and they would retreat farther toward cover. Little did I realize they were leading us into a trap. The battalion was spread far to the left and right, sweeping toward a magnificent hill, when the bloop sound started. Machine gun fire erupted from the hills. Mortars rained like hail from above, and explosions hit the ground with tremendous accuracy. Charlie had our command group zeroed in. The rounds were hitting in and around Captain Rekchek and his entire command. I saw Lieutenant Sutton, our executive officer, second in command, or XO, running toward Captain Rekchek. Mortar rounds started raining down on all of them. Sutton dove down between Lieutenant Richard Chapa and another Marine. The rounds seemed to stop. Sutton got up to proceed toward Rekchek when a mortar round exploded, blowing another man in half and throwing Sutton from the blast as if he were a rag doll. Several Marines ran over to the wounded men. Lieutenant Chapa had been protected from the discharge because Lieutenant Sutton and the other Marine absorbed most of the blast. Bumgarner and his crew were ordered to return suppressing mortar fire. Dead Marines were everywhere. Both Sutton and the other Marine were taken to the location where we laid our dead. The wounded were taken immediately to a hastily established LZ, where they were sent back to the LPH Okinawa emergency room, or, in more severe cases, the hospital ship Sanctuary. The choppers flew in, and Charlie erupted with machine gun and mortar fire again. We were inspired by the bravery of our chopper pilots. They kept coming and removing the wounded. Our mortar rounds hit the Gooks hard, and they went silent once again. Lieutenant Chapa asked a corpsman about his friend, Lieutenant Sutton. "Sutton's over there, with the dead," the corpsman said, pointing to the line of poncho-covered corpses. "He's second from the last." Lieutenant Chapa went over to his old friend to pay his last respects. He lifted the dark green poncho back. The entire left side of Sutton's face and body were fully covered in blood. Lieutenant Chapa said a quick prayer and gave one last parting glance. He looked again and felt like something was amiss. Lieutenant Chapa saw there was a glitter of moisture in the slit of Sutton's right eye. It was a tear. He bent forward and looked even closer at Sutton's face, and saw that Sutton had been looking at him through the smallest slit under his eyelid. Chapa then noticed fresh blood dripping from Sutton's wounds. "My God," he yelled back to the corpsman. "He's still alive! Sutton's still alive!" Sutton had been lying there with the dead, alive and aware, but not able to say a word. Several Marines came over to assist him, and another medevac was called in. Doc Eastman bandaged him up as best he could. The chopper came in, but was under heavy fire. Regardless, 4 Marines grabbed each of Sutton's limbs and carried him to the chopper. Once he was on the floor, one of the Marines aboard immediately began pushing hard and fast on Sutton's chest. The engine roared, and debris flew everywhere from the rotating blades. AK-47 bullets punched through the skin of the chopper as it rose. The door gunner's M60 machine gun exploded with flames of bullets as he fired into the enemy positions. With Sutton aboard, the chopper disappeared in the distance on its way to the USS Sanctuary. The next orders were to sweep the hills along the perimeter of the valley, and that is when the enemy mortars resumed. They were right on us again, and the explosions walked directly toward me. I got down, sure that I would end up like Sutton. Then, as if the sounds of my own defiant voice could assert my right to live or drown out the explosions and the desperate cries of my fellow Marines, I screamed. My incoherent screaming always wakes me up. As the ceiling comes into focus in the darkness above, I begin to feel the wetness in the bed beneath my 70-year-old body, soaked from sweat. I sit up on the side of the bed and stare into the carpet for a minute. My wife and I no longer sleep together because of these nightmares. In the bathroom, I see some old stranger in the mirror. The feeling of being that boy back in Vietnam with my platoon has not yet left me. I splash cold water on my face and keep my hands pressed there, pressing my fingers hard against my eyelids. It's not the first time I've relived the battle, and even now, 52 years later, I know it won't be the last. I return to bed and lie back on the dry side, but I won't be sleeping again tonight. Instead, I stare into the darkness and think about how I ended up in that war and in the Special Landing Force. I think about how I survived it and how so many of my friends, like Hart, did not. I think about that innocent and invincible young boy who stepped on a jet airplane for the very first time in his life. If I could go back in time and meet him on that tarmac, I wouldn't tell him about the day he almost died, but I also wouldn't stop him.